They asked me to borrow the mic here.
Okay.
They said this mic is stronger, so I'll borrow it and then I'll hand it to you.
Okay. I was just thinking that exact same thing. I was going to say it's nice sharing a hot seat with you.
Good evening and welcome. We'd ask you all to find a seat if you can. We promised we would start on time, and we're going to try sticking to that as much as possible. Some others we expect may wander in during the course of the evening, but we are glad to have you here. By way of introduction, my name is Pam Marsh. I'm the State Representative for Southern Jackson County, and I am delighted to welcome all of you here to tonight's Wildfire Forum, an opportunity for us all to come together to address the fundamental health and safety challenges that are facing our community. Some of you may have been in the audience a couple of months ago. In the mid-September, we held a smoke and fire summit that addressed issues around forest management, economic resilience, health impacts, and climate change. But a month after that gathering, we watched in horror, many of us, from a distance as the town of Paradise, California, incinerated in front of our eyes on the television. The vulnerability of our community and the health and safety issues facing us at a time when fire season is longer and much more volatile than ever really forces us to focus on strategies and resources that protect us, even in the face of difficult and persistent challenges. So tonight is our opportunity to learn from the individuals and agencies charged with keeping us safe. In a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Don Ferguson, who has kindly once again agreed to moderate the discussion. Don is a retired BLM Natural Resources Staff Administrator who has worked for the U.S. Forest Service in Washington and Oregon and with the Medford District Bureau of Land Management. He retired from the BLM in 2006, but remains active in managing large fires throughout the United States. His current focus is in managing the public information needs generated by large fires, hurricanes, and other large-scale emergencies. So I think we are in good hands here tonight with Don. But first, before I hand the mic over, I want to acknowledge a gap in our lineup tonight. Some of you may have noticed that the federal government stopped working a few weeks ago. Merv George, who is the supervisor of the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, is on furlough and unable to be here. Now, we know that the U.S. Forest Service battles fires on federal forest land, so Merv's absence is a big hole in our story. This is an inconvenience for us here tonight, but even without knowing everything about what's going on in the back rooms, I am confident in believing that the work that would be preparing us for fire season is falling far behind. Nonetheless, we soldier on tonight. And the very good news is that Merv's absence allowed us to invite Gene Davies, who is chief of the Greensprings Rural Fire District, to join us. Now, Gene's operation, make no mistake, is pretty much the polar opposite of the U.S. Forest Service in terms of resources and manpower. But the volunteer firefighters who exist in this region and in many places across the state are really key to community safety. They are very often the first people to come upon flames or to assess a fire for risk. So I think Gene will be a really added important part of our conversation here tonight. And finally, a few logistics before we get on to the substance of the evening. I want to thank a few people. Paige Pruitt, who has handled all of the logistics in the event coordination. I want to thank Asante for making this wonderful facility available to us. I want to thank Kate Jackson for helping with sign-in at the front. And of course, I want to thank these professionals who have taken time out of their lives and their work to be here with us and to share. Finally, I want to acknowledge the elected officials that I've seen in the audience. Representative Kim Wallen is here. Thank you, Kim. Senator Jeff Golden, Ashland Mayor John Stromberg, County Commissioners Bob Strasser and Colleen Roberts, Medford School District Member Todd Moore, and then we have Representative Molly McCarthy from Senator Wyden's office and Amy Amorine from Senator Merkley's office. And did I miss any other elected officials in the audience? Okay, great to have you all here. Turn off your cell phones, please. If you need to leave, bathrooms are to the left or the right out of the door. We are not going to take a break. We recognize that your time is valuable and it's a dark winter evening, so we're really grateful that you came here tonight. We want to make the very best use of your time, but feel free at any point, obviously, if you need to get up and leave, to get up, wander out, and then rejoin us. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to the capable hands of Don Ferguson.
Good evening. I'm going to introduce these panelists one at a time, and they'll make a short presentation each, and then I'm going to expose them to some other questions. As we started talking about this meeting a month or so ago, Representative Marsh and Paige Pruitt and I brainstormed some topic questions, sort of anticipating what kinds of things you might want to hear from these folks. We're not going to do a question and answer from the audience for some time management reasons, but I've tried to anticipate things that I thought you would need to hear about. And I talked about those with all of our presenters as well, so they wouldn't be surprised by any of that. Having said all that, when we get to the end of this evening, and we're going to quit at 8 o'clock, if there's still something that you were really hoping to hear about, or a question that you felt we might have avoided or just failed to address, Pam Marsh has invited me to ask you to contact her office, and she will forward that. I'll help with that too, and we'll get that to these folks and get some kind of a response back to you. And so thanks very much. The order we're going to go in here is first Jim Walker, the Oregon State Fire Marshal. He leads the Oregon office of the State Fire Marshal Bureau under the Department of Oregon State Police. He oversees the agency's administration, emergency response, fire and life safety services, and fire and life safety education branches. He was hired as the Chief Deputy State Fire Marshal in May of 2009. And before that, Jim was Fire Operations Director for Oregon Department of Forestry, where he gained experience managing ODF's statewide fire operations, specifically including directing the statewide aviation resources. Jim.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you folks tonight. I did spend an awful lot of days down here with you this summer, but those were under reactive conditions. And so I really like being here tonight because tonight is proactive. Tonight we're here to try to see if we can all collectively come up with some solutions to this problem that we're having. Because as most of you know, we kind of for a while said, well, that was just an epic year. And the year after that, that was an epic year. And what we're really trying to see is this may be the new norm. And if this is the new norm, then we need to come up with new solutions. And so I appreciate everybody tonight taking their time to actually spend with us, and hopefully we give you some information, or at least a little bit of information that's useful to you in moving forward as we look towards 2019. Our role actually with the State Fire Marshal's office is we always say that we're Plan C in the response process. What you have before you is a number of the local folks and that local response, and that's really where it starts, is with those local resources. They also have some really good mutual aid resources or neighbors all around them that surround them, that resources to help them as well. It's only when it exceeds their capacity then do we bring what we call the state resources. So I think it's really important for you folks to understand when we say state resources, that means just structural resources from around the state. So no different than what Ashland provides or Medford provides. These are the Portland resources, the Eugene resources, the Clackamas County resources. A lot of those folks, over 40% of those are volunteers. So we need to understand that, you know, does it take a little while for us to get here and to respond? It does, because we're asking volunteers and those folks at their departments to stop doing what they're doing.
Chief, excuse me, is your microphone on?
Jesse?
That's going to work a lot better.
My humblest apologies. Does this work a little better?
It sounded really good from up here.
I just solved a majority of the problems or the concerns or the issues that we had tonight. So
We got time for you to start over.
yeah, no, I apologize for that, but I was just really was trying to emphasize is that you saw probably a lot of different apparatus and equipment come to you from different parts of the state, and that's really what our job is to help to bring those resources to those communities that are impacted, and to work for those fire chiefs to supplement the resources that they have, really to take on that huge task that we've seen over the last couple of years. And they're more than willing to do that. And what I call that is just neighbor helping neighbor. And so I know that Medford and Ashland and Grants Pass and a lot of your resources and the smaller departments from around this area have gone to other parts of the state to help out as well. So we'll continue to do that. But that's kind of our role as Plan C.
Let me introduce Dave. So Dave Lorenz, let's see, this is working for me? Okay. Dave is Southern Oregon Director for Oregon Department of Forestry. He's now in his 33rd year with the department. He graduated Oregon State University and Linfield College and has worked in the agency's private forests, state forests, and protection divisions. Most of his field experience in Southern Oregon. Before he went to ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry, Dave worked for the Coos Forest Protective Association and the U.S. Forest Service in seasonal positions. This year will be his 39th fire season.
Is this one working? All right. Jim didn't say it, but we actually started our careers together with CFPA. So he doesn't look like he is older than 39, but he is. So I also want to say thank you. Thank you to Representative Marsh for the opportunity to be here this evening, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules and evenings to be here. From my standpoint, this is about education, and it is through education, I think, that we all learn. We learn from you what's important to you, but hopefully you can learn something from us that will help you all get through the fire seasons that are definitely coming. Something that would be helpful for me is to maybe show a show of hands. Who is from Jackson County? All right. Who's from Josephine County? So a few. And who's not from either of those two counties? Okay. All right. That's helpful for me to know that. So I do work for the Department of Forestry. We have three main field programs. We manage state forests, we help private landowners manage our land, and we have our fire protection program. Sometimes we're referred to as the largest fire department in the state of Oregon. We protect 16 million acres of forest land and grazing land across the state. And in Jackson and Josephine County, what that means is we're protecting basically all the forest land that is not owned and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. So we're protecting your lands if you got forest land. We do that through something that's referred to in statute as a complete and coordinated system. And that system has several prongs, and the first is prevention. And for us, the best fire is the fire that never starts. When we talk about prevention a lot, but that really is key to looking towards the future and how we get through fire seasons is prevention. And we've got a great partner there with the Keep Oregon Green Association, if you've heard them and know who they are. Another prong of our fire suppression program or our fire program is pre-suppression, and there's a whole lot of pieces to that, but that is really about fuels reduction across the forest and about defensible space around homes. And there are a couple handouts that I left out there on the table for you that talk about both of those prongs. If you're interested in them, please take them. There's more information available in those that you can refer to at a future time. Also, early detection is really important to our fire program. We've got a state-of-the-art smoke detection camera system. Most of that is centered in Southern Oregon. There are 14 of those cameras in Jackson and Josephine County, and they've proved to be invaluable for a lot of reasons in the fire program. And then, of course, suppression. And Oregon statute defines any uncontrolled fire as a nuisance and directs us to put it out if it threatens lands that we're responsible to protect. And we take that very seriously. Our number one priority is life, and our second is the forest resource. Safety is a priority for us, for the public, and for our firefighters. We strive to minimize firefighting costs and resource loss. There are times that, and we really strive to keep the fires small. There are times that the situations out in the forest with the weather, et cetera, makes it difficult to do that. We have a target that we keep 98% of all of our fires at 10 acres or less. And in the current year, including the 2018 fire season, we're likely not to hit that target. All of what we do, we don't do any of it alone. Jim referred to the partners that are scattered around, and we've got partners all around next to us. Our rural fire districts are huge, landowners are huge, but I could go on and on about partners, and I won't name them all because we don't have the time, but partnerships are huge in all we do. And quite honestly, and I didn't say this earlier, but if you don't know it, you all are part of the complete and coordinated wildfire system in Oregon. And I appreciate, what you do for that process as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Chris Chambers with Ashland Fire and Rescue Forest Division Chief. Chris is an Ashland native, a graduate of OSU College of Forestry. He worked for the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM for 5 seasons before joining Ashland Fire and Rescue in 2002. He now serves as Forest Division Chief. Chris coordinated the National Fire Plan grants for 6 years with hundreds of private landowners, and he co-authored the 2004 Ashland Community Wildfire Protection Plan and the 2005 Jackson County Integrated Fire Plan. Chris serves on the International Association of Fire Chiefs Fire Department Exchange Program, helping to further wildfire safety programs in communities across the country, and responsible for a lot of the smoke you see coming up out of the Ashland watershed.
I'll take credit for that. Good evening. It's really nice to see everybody here, and thank you for spending your time with us this evening. I think it's obviously a very important point in time for us as citizens of the Rogue Valley, and having grown up here, I have a pretty good feel for what that's like, and now raising my own family here, I definitely identify with the struggles that we're all experiencing in the Rogue Valley. What I bring to the table for tonight is something maybe a little different than my colleagues here, and fire suppression and response isn't my primary job, though I do that as well on the side when needed. But primarily, my job is making things better before the fire starts, and to make their jobs most effective when they respond. And in my colleagues at Ashland Fire and Rescue and all of our mutual aid partners in the Rogue Valley, when they come to help us, I want them to be safe and to be successful. And of course, we're serving the citizens of our town, and I think Ashland has a unique program and a unique experience to share in the Rogue Valley, in that we have self-identified as being very prone to wildfire, and that's nothing new to anybody in the Rogue Valley, and mostly not new to anybody in Ashland unless they just moved to town. But in recognizing that since the 80s, and we've been actively managing city forest lands for wildfire protection and for forest health since the mid-90s. And so we've accumulated a lot of experience on the wildland side as forest managers and ecosystem managers. And that's primarily my day-to-day job, and representing the city and the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, which is a partnership with the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy, and Lomacotsi Restoration Project, all of whom, except the Forest Service, of course, are here tonight also. But restoring the Ashland watershed, and reducing the fuels to protect the community when the wildfire comes. And then the other part of my job is also overseeing wildfire safety in the built part of Ashland, so what we call commonly the wildland-urban interface, which is basically encompasses all of Ashland. And that's no small job in and of itself, especially when we reflect on things like the Camp Fire and what happened in Redding this summer, and we start really scratching our heads and losing hair over how do we protect a community full of older homes made of wood, surrounded by vegetation that is, by and large, pretty flammable. So what I hope to contribute is that perspective of prevention and how to make citizens and our community safer before the fire visits us, and then also what do we do when the fire happens, and how do we respond appropriately and get people out of harm's way.
let me introduce. I just met Gene Davis, the fire chief for Greensprings Rural Fire District this summer when the Klamathon fire burned into Oregon, and provided a pretty focused threat to that community there. And Gene was up dealing with that. Co-founder of the Greensprings Rural Fire District and has served as the fire chief of the district for more than 15 years. This is an all-volunteer fire agency serving the Greensprings community, 20 miles southeast of Ashland. Before that, Gene worked in the Los Angeles Fire Department, which must have been an amazing thing, in the Volunteer Auxiliary Communications Unit, and he also has worked for the Oregon State Fire Marshal as a communications unit leader with an all-hazard incident management team. Gene?
Thank you very much, Don. I was a little surprised at being invited here, being from such a small district, but appreciate the opportunity nonetheless. And thank you, everybody, for showing up this evening. It's a good sign to see so much interest in preventing and helping to mitigate our wildfire risk. I run a very, very small fire district. We help protect about 250 square miles with very limited resources, limited financially, and also in terms of volunteer personnel who would be available. We're kind of in a unique position. We're isolated, so we're almost always first on scene to a given fire outbreak. So we do have some interesting perspectives that are generated from that factor. We're seeing more fire starts every year, and these fire starts are becoming much more intense than ever before. So there's a really huge concern on my part in trying to get my community prepared with fuel reduction or evacuation plans in the event that things go south. So I really do welcome this collaborative effort. I am very concerned, though, that what we've been seeing in the last few years is not so much the new normal, but perhaps just the beginning of a trend that is going to escalate a little bit every year. So what we do now in terms of working together, fuel reduction, community awareness of wildfire danger, I think these things are going to become increasingly important in the years to come.
Thank you, Gene. I wonder, is this little mic working here as well? Awesome. With that, Gene, I think I want to go back to Chris because I was talking with Chris earlier and he had some points that he said he would either get to in his intro or by my invitation about both speaking to the cohesive strategy and the need to all work together, all of these parts in motion at the same time, but a little bit about how did we get to this place with changes in the forest fuels receptivity to fire, the trend toward larger fires, and maybe some of the studies you've done specific to local fuels.
Well, I wish I could say I had done studies, but I'm just going to rely on my very learned and excellent colleagues at the Nature Conservancy, or in the back there, specifically Dr. Carrie Metlin, who just published a paper on this very topic. And what it describes, and obviously those of us who have been around, we don't remember it being this bad growing up here. And so things have definitely gotten worse. And there's a great presentation. Has anybody been to the Era of Megafire presentation? It was actually in this room last year. A few hands went up, and we hosted it a couple of times at Southern Oregon University over the past couple of years. Dr. Paul Hesberg does a really good job, one of the preeminent scientists in the field of fire and forest ecology, of describing how did we get to this point? Why all of a sudden do we have so much smoke in the air? And really, it's not all of a sudden. This has been a problem that has been ripening for a long, long time, as far back as 160 years ago, when the role of the Native American tribes, the Shasta-Takelma tribes that inhabited this area, when the European settlers came and the tribes were extirpated from this area, they knew how to live with wildfire. And that's really what we're scratching our heads about right now, is how do we live with wildfire? Because it's clearly an important piece of the ecology in our forests, but at the same time, it is an enormous problem. Before the settlement of the area, frequent fires, and this is what Carrie's research addresses, is that fire was a frequent occurrence. Every 8 to 10 years on the drier forests of southern Oregon, there was a cleansing fire that came through. It burned out a lot of brush and a lot of seedlings. Trees averaged about 50 per acre, and typically big trees that could survive wildfires, but some small ones poking up and replacing the big ones. That went on for a long time. And essentially, when European settlers came, and then eventually we established a suppression policy that we were going to put all fires out by 10 a.m. the next day, that changed the character of our forests enormously. And we also started cutting down a lot of the big trees that were fire resistant. So there are forests out there now that have not seen their fire cycle, that 8-year cleansing fire. They haven't seen that since the mid-1800s. They've missed 20 fire cycles. And so we shouldn't be surprised now that there is a lot of fuel out in the forest. And it is fueling larger and larger fires, what Dr. Hesper calls the era of mega fires, the name of the presentation. And there's a TED Talk if you want to log on to Google and find that TED Talk. It's only 15 minutes, it's pretty quick, it's very informative. Another colleague who's now retired described this situation as putting your finger over the garden hose. Fire was a steady trickle for a long time on our landscape. And then we just put our thumb over the hose. And now the pressure is building up and building up. And eventually you just can't keep your thumb on the hose anymore and it explodes. And that's what we're seeing currently, is fire is exploding onto the landscape quite literally and causing a lot of changes to the forest, threatening communities, obviously causing a lot of smoke in the air, a lot of things that we didn't really intend when we started putting out all those fires so long ago, but it is an unintended consequence of the suppression policy. So that's a little background and just for a common frame of reference and how we got to where we are right now. And there's a lot of upshots from that and solutions and how do we get to a more sustainable place in our forests.
Yeah, thank you. And so that speaks to changes in forest fuels type. Have you, anybody care to comment on demographic changes in settlement patterns, development? Because we also have the risk from within communities, right? I would invite any of you to. Yep, you go ahead.
All right. I'll even turn it on this time.
Okay, push it straight up. That should do it.
Working now?
Yep.
Here we go. You know, what we know is that when you look at the population, and specifically the population growth in Washington, Oregon, and California, it really is out in that what we call the wildland-urban interface. And so most folks are wanting to be, you know, close to the city limits, but just outside of it. So you're starting to see a greater encroachment on those forested fuels that Chris was just talking about and the volatility of those. So what we're doing is we're just adding more fuel to the problem that we're currently seeing with the forest. And it's increasingly growing at a fairly high rate, specifically here in Oregon.
And complicated, I think, fire suppression, but they generally acknowledge that there's a trend toward fire season is 60, 80 days longer than it was 20 years ago, roughly. Am I in the ballpark there? So I know there's a lot of folks in the room here critically concerned with climate change. How has that affected your preparedness planning? Dave, you want to speak to that?
So in terms of preparedness, I mean, I think we go through a similar process as we have done, for a long time. But we do take a look, and we have tried to expand and increase our resources to respond to the wildfires that we're having. One of the things that's been really beneficial, 5 of the last 6 fire seasons have been worse than average. We budget locally for an average worst fire season, and 5 out of the last 6 have been worse, way worse than average. And so one of the things that's been really beneficial is some additional severity funding that we started getting a few years back. That's funded by landowner assessments that you all pay. It's also funded by some general fund, and thank you to the legislature and the legislators that are here that provide that funding. But having those additional severity resources, when I'm talking about there's a whole lot of aviation resources, Type 2 helicopters, our Type 1, our large air tanker that's stationed here, as well as a crew, some detection aircraft, and some other things. But those have been really key, and we have, in the last, few years, been able to increase those severity resources a bit. So.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, we've started looking at things a lot earlier as well because things are starting earlier. We used to look on average about July 23rd was the first conflagration or the state mobilization of resources to an incident somewhere in the state of Oregon. And over the last couple summers, we've seen that in the early part of June. So knowing that, we know that we're just one part of this complete and coordinated system. So we're that structural piece. And so we started here a number of years ago training with the Oregon Department of Forestry and others. So we actually have incident management team training together, and we try to meet early March, early April, because we know that by having that collaboration and that partnership, when we get into a chaotic situation, we all know what our responsibilities are, and we can be more cohesive than if not. We've also started working with a lot of the smaller fire departments around the state to help to support them to come up with plans and put plans in place for what types of resources we might need in those given areas and what types of resources that we can send. So we know very early on in the summer now what we do have available for task forces. And when I say task forces, that's a complement of 5 engines. The state of Oregon, if we really have a lot of incidents occurring at the same time, could put together about 22 strike teams or 22 task forces. That means those resources are available to come from, some other part of the state to help another part of the state. There's 318 fire departments in the state of Oregon. Not all of them can obviously participate because some of them are solely volunteer and some of them may only have one apparatus, and they need to leave that within their communities. But we can muster about 22, and so we do task force leader training early on, fire team training early on, and we see it earlier and earlier all the time because, like you say, it's no longer a July, August, September issue. It's an issue that's starting a lot earlier and ending a lot later.
Thank you. I was talking with Gene earlier. You've been up at the Greensprings 15 years now, long enough probably to see some changes, some trends, and just when you thought maybe fire season was over for us locally, Klamath Falls had a fire. Tell us about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there was a very recent fire in Klamath Falls on Stucco Mountain. I believe it went somewhere around 10 acres. And looking at some of the photographs from this fire, it was really shocking. Here we are in January, and I'm looking at a photograph of a hillside that's on fire with 15, 20-foot flame lengths in some areas. So this is really highly unusual, and to me just is another indication of the trend that we're seeing over the last several years.
How does that influence your planning for protection for your community? Well,
It certainly does lend a huge sense of urgency to pre-planning, but it's with the limited resources that we have, it's it's a difficult proposition to really be able to say that, yeah, we've planned for every contingency up here. And we're always very thankful for the resources that are available locally with our Rogue Valley strike teams and task forces, and also the resources that the state fire marshal can bring to bear when we have a really big fire.
Yes, go ahead.
From the prevention perspective, it also, the climate change also causes some issues for us. And one of our big tools in our toolbox is using fire proactively, control burning or prescribed burning. And when we go through winter time, we spend a lot of time cutting brush and small trees and putting it into neat little burn piles. And then we expect it's going to rain and the ground's going to get wet and the logs and all that stuff around are going to get wet and we're going to burn those burn piles. And with climate change and drier winters happening, we lose those opportunities to go out there and do the kind of burning that we need to do to get ahead of the issue. I mentioned 50 trees per acre was the historic condition. We're at over 175 trees per acre now in the Ashland area. So we have a lot of fuel to deal with. And when we don't get the conditions to deal with that fuel, when it's wet and cold, then it just sits there and we keep it during fire season when we definitely don't want that fuel sitting out there in the forest. Just anecdotally, we've had fire control burns that we've done burning those piles, and we had fire creep down into stumps that used to get wet when it rained, and rained a lot, but that doesn't really happen so much anymore, or big logs, and fire will just hang out there. We had fire hang out there for 7 weeks in a stump or a log, I can't remember which. And then it got windy and dry in the middle of, I think it was February, and that fire popped up and it went off. And it didn't do anything bad, but it makes it really difficult to do the work that we need to do to get ahead of the problem under climate change.
So what we've just talked about, as grim as it seems, is a increasingly difficult and complex fire suppression picture, or community protection picture, right? And so we talk about fire in terms of risk management, both risk to communities and risk to firefighters. And you're always balancing those. So you're willing to invest the risk to your firefighters to protect values at risk in the communities. Can any of you say anything about risk assessment, how you decide what you're going to, where you're going to accept risk for your firefighters and for your organization? I hope that's not a big surprise to you, but.
So that's a tough question. We train all of our firefighters to be their own safety officer. We ask our firefighters to be their own safety officer. We do that through a lot of training, education, a lot of on-the-job training. And we ask them to look, assess the situation when they get out to a fire. And we ask them to, if they feel it's unsafe, we ask them to say something. We want to know if they think it's unsafe. We also want to know what the hazard is and how, are there ways to mitigate that hazard? For example, if there's a critical piece of fire line that needs to go in and there is a snag overhanging it and it's just not safe, can we fall the snag? Can we go around it? Are there some other things we can do? And so we ask our firefighters to pay attention because, again, as I said earlier, safety is number one for us. Safety for our firefighters and safety for the public. And so, when we can't make something safe, we will have to take some different strategy or tactic. But that is how we go about assessing, and we ask our firefighters to do that on their own. And when we have incident management teams out, we've got safety officers that are helping with all of that sort of thing. And so I don't know if that helps, Don, but.
It does. Jim, have you something to say?
Yeah, this is a good opportunity to kind of build on what Dave's talking about. One of the things that we had to do with the State Fire Marshal's office's teams is we added additional line safety support. And as you know, emergency responders want to do everything they possibly can to mitigate loss of life or property. And so this is kind of my plug to you folks, is help us to be able to help you. Because when those resources, when they get there, especially those state resources, they're arriving usually after working all day. They're arriving at nighttime. They're arriving early in the morning. They haven't had an opportunity to really get a good visual look at where they're working. And so we rely on those folks an awful lot to make really smart decisions. But when they get in there, the first thing, like I say, they want to do is they wanted to get in there and protect your home. So when they start talking about defensible space and we start talking about the things that you could do within your community, don't just think of, well, this is one more thing that I have to do. Think of it as if somebody that you knew was responding to your home to help to save it. Are you giving them the ability to do that? And so that's my big plea to you folks, is help us to be able to help you. And that's that piece of giving us that true defensible space to get those folks in there, because we do take safety seriously.
Chris, how are we doing in the city of Ashland for assessing risk and mitigating risk to structures?
It's a complicated picture. Risk assessments are a tool that's used in our industry continually. Risk assessments can look at really big areas. There's a risk assessment that covers the entire western United States. There's a risk assessment for the state of Oregon that looks at where are our vulnerable areas. There's a risk assessment for the Rogue River Basin that prioritizes areas for wildfire fuels reduction, and there's a risk assessment that just came out of the Pacific Northwest that talks about communities at risk. And I can guarantee that of the top 20 communities in Washington and Oregon that we live, you and I live in most of those places on the list there that are some of the most dangerous places on their list. Medford actually was pretty high on the list. I was a little surprised. Higher than Ashland. So it's an issue of scale. And how do you look at what the risk is? Well, you look at the state of Oregon, and the risk to a certain place might not be that bad. But if you look at just one community, and within that community, you need to consider where you live in relation to wildland areas. What's the propensity for fire to throw embers that might land on your roof and in your gutter and next to your house? And so that's what we're trying to wrestle with right now in the city of Ashland. And I don't know of many places that are doing it the way that we're trying to do it, but we're trying to map that risk out to a very, very fine scale. And the problem with some of the products out there, there's even one called Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer that I've played around with at the state level, but when you try to look at your house, it doesn't translate because there's a scale issue with how they look at wildfire risk from the state of Oregon down to your single house. And I want to change that so that people can feel like they can interact with all this great technology that's out there, and you can go online and find your house and find out something meaningful. And so what we're working on right now, and a lot of communities are doing something similar. I know it's happening in Medford and out in Fire District 3, some in Fire District 5 around the valley, and other places where we do have a common mapping program amongst all of us that we can use, and you can actually assess that risk down at the scale of one house. And that can be very interesting information for you to have if it's your house, right? Well, how did the fire department think about my house? And what could I do to make it better? And that's something that we're working on also, is a portal to that information. So it's easy to understand what you can do to reduce your risk and to make our efforts a lot more successful when the fire does happen.
Gene, I would invite you to comment that I saw on your Facebook page a month or so ago that a home burned in your district that you couldn't get to. You couldn't get up their driveway, and it must have been pretty hard for you. So.
Oh, certainly, and that is a big challenge that we face in our location, which is basically isolated and heavily forested. It can't really even be classified as an urban interface or a wildland interface. We're basically a heavily forested wildland area with homes located all over the 250 square miles that we serve. So it's a very difficult proposition. And Don mentioned a home that we lost recently due to fire. This was a flue fire. And unfortunately, our ability to act on this fire was extremely limited by very poor, almost non-existent access to the structure. So we couldn't safely bring any of our equipment within reach, and we just had very limited resources. We could only flow very small amounts of water on this fire. So this is something that we depend on our residents to help us with. and that is maintaining good access for emergency equipment to your home or business, and then taking care to reduce the fuel load around your structure, keeping your fire breaks clean, and make our job at least possible. In the case of this structure fire, it was an impossible situation for us from the beginning because we couldn't even get up, couldn't get any of our equipment up to this place. So that's a very, very important point, that fire prevention and mitigation really starts with each individual on their property, how they treat it, and how well prepared they are.
Thank you all for that. Anything else on that topic? So another risk to, no matter how well you do, let's say you live in a green belt in town and there's nothing burnable on your property, another big risk to all of you is smoke. And it can come from something so far away that you've never even been there. And as you know, we had regional air quality impairment the last couple of years, significant. In terms of community protection, that's one of the things that all these folks are trying to protect you from, the economic losses and the health impacts of smoke. What can any of you tell me that we can do? Are there any particular strategies available to us that can help us minimize smoke impacts from wildfire?
I'll take the first step.
Okay.
Well, that is the big question, of course. What can we do about the smoke? And I want to read a quick quote from Paul Hesburgh in the Era of Megafire presentation. And after all of Dr. Hesburgh's studies and hundreds of research publications, he says, "There is no future without fire and smoke. That option is actually not on the table." So the only choice is, how do we let that smoke happen in a way that it does not have the impacts to our economy, to our health? And that's a tricky proposition, and that's what we're wrestling with in Ashland in our forest projects. And how do we get that burning done? How do we let the smoke go away from town, away from the valley? It's not always going to be perfect. We are going to have some smoke, but a little bit of smoke in the spring or the fall is a lot better than that heavy wildfire smoke that we experience during the summer. And it's not a one-to-one trade-off. Yeah, we're still going to have wildfires. We're not going to get rid of wildfires altogether. That's just not possible. But we can definitely minimize the impact. It's one of the pieces of the cohesive strategy for restoration in the Rogue Basin, a handout that is actually out there, so you can pick it up later if you didn't get one on your way in. This is something that's being pushed by the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative. I just joined the board of that organization, but there are other board members in the audience out here working on something called the Rogue Basin Strategy. It's a 20 to 30 year proposition, and considering it took us well over 100 years to get into this mess, 20 or 30 years isn't bad, but I know that's also not great news when we're having smoke every summer. But if we could tackle this with an aggressive pursuit of it, we can reduce wildfire risk by up to 70% across the Rogue Basin. We can reduce wildfire risk to homes by up to 50%. And when we do that, we can reduce some of the smoke exposure to our communities, to our health, and to our economy. And, long term, we have to really engage with that. We have to interact with our politicians and demand that those kinds of initiatives get funded. It's an expensive thing to go out there and do all this work, but it also puts people to work. We're talking about 1,700 jobs over 20 years. I mean, that's a lot more than all the people in here many times over. So we're also talking about a new economy for the Rogue Valley, a green economy, a lot of forestry jobs, and we send a lot of logs to local mills when we do that work. Ashland, which 10 or 20 years ago, who would have thought of Ashland as a place that's going to send a lot of logs to the mill? Oh, we sent 15 million board feet of logs to local mills from Roseburg to Wairika over the past 8 or 9 years, and that's jobs in all those places, not to mention all of the forest workers who are directly making a living on the ground who live in our communities. And so there's an upside to all this. I wish I could say that there's a way to make the smoke go away tomorrow, but unfortunately, from where I sit, that's not going to happen. But what we can do is aggressively pursue all avenues, and that's one of them, and a very hopeful one. But there are others, and we have to have all of our tools in the toolbox.
Yes, Dave.
So just building on what Chris said about prescribed fire, I really do agree with what you say there. And there are some new proposed smoke management rules that are out there, and they actually have been approved by the Board of Forestry. I think it was last week. They're moving through the system. The EQC, Environmental Quality Commission, is kind of next up. And those rules, if approved and they become effective, should create some additional opportunities for prescribed fire at the right time, at the right place, to try to minimize smoke in communities while still creating more opportunities to minimize that fuel loading out there. And those rules do give local communities a bit more voice in terms of how much smoke they may want to endure as well. So those are out there. Just know that. So that is something to know. The other thing I would just say too, in terms of reducing smoke during fire season, 70% of our fires that occur on our protection are human caused. And lightning storms that come through are our biggest problem because we get a whole bunch of starts all at once, and it can overwhelm our system. But throw on top of that a handful of human-caused fires, and it's not anything that we need, and it's as firefighters, and it's nothing that you need as citizens as well. So prevention, again, I mentioned that earlier, but that is really key, I think, in terms of even something like reducing the amount of smoke. And you all can help us with that as well.
Let's just keep talking about prevention here a little bit. We'll move away from smoke, and we'll talk about intercepting ignitions, prevention. We're not doing real well at preventing lightning. There is something in the folklore. I was exposed to the ideas this summer. Some folks suggested that we put lightning rods on every mountain and somehow protect ourselves from natural fire in a fire-dependent ecosystem. But I don't think we're going to do very much with intercepting lightning fires. Human-caused fires, it seems like we're doing better all the time with that. What else can you say? Give me a couple of strategies we could do to improve prevention of human-caused fires. And if you can't come up with something, I'm going to ask you something tougher. So.
Looks like Dave's getting ready to talk, so I figure if I just put a little bit out there, then he'll, put a bow around it and get you to where you really want to go. But I think because as we started seeing mega fires over the last number of years, our focus, at least from the state agency, has been really towards suppression and asking that question, what do we need as far as resources to protect life and property? And I don't think we've necessarily done a real good job about asking for those prevention tools. And so that's one of the things, and I'm glad there's a lot of legislative folks in here because I spent the last probably 6 months going in front of the E-Board asking for funding to fund all of those firefighters that responded from around the state on the suppression. I have not gone in front of any of the legislative folks and asked for prevention. And that's really where I think we need to start focusing, is on that prevention piece. Because if we can just invest more in prevention and stop these fires, as many as we possibly can, that are caused by humans, we're going to be in a lot better spot as far as the state goes, and obviously the state funding as well. Because we've invested in data. We've started really trying to look and collect as much data as we possibly can to find out what are those things that are starting fires, and then what are those things that we could then maybe prevent. Because as you know, some of these things, when we talk about human-caused fires, one of the big challenges that California is seeing is down power lines or exploding transformers. Okay, that's considered to be a human-caused fire. What can we really do, to mitigate those types of things. We've looked at things that we can do for dragging chains down the roads. Has anybody seen the little things you can put over your chains now, to keep that from occurring? Believe it or not, if you look at going down I-5, we've had a number of fire starts this year. Those are the types of things that we're looking at. Can we come up with something that might be able to help to prevent those things? So what I'm really asking is if you have some really great ideas that you can think of that we might be able to look at, and if we can get some support and we can get some funding and we can get some investment in folks to really start putting that emphasis on prevention as opposed to suppression, I think we'll be in a little bit better spot.
Thank you.
So tying a bow around that. So one, to build on what Jim said there, to really know, what's causing the fires, what are the real issues requires fire investigation. We investigate every fire that we have. But I've wondered whether, some additional investment there, something more robust to really get down to the nut about what is causing, a given fire. Yeah, it's a chainsaw, but what about that chainsaw, for example? And so I think we do a really good job, but I've wondered whether that's a place we could invest some more. And I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand again if you so choose, but how many of you, and so changing away from kind of in fire investigation, how many of you have kind of looked at our fire regulations, so Oregon Department of Forestry's fire regulations, and not really known exactly what you could do or not do on a given day? I mean, are they completely clear all the time? You can't raise your hand. So we recognized that a couple of years ago, and that there was inconsistencies between our districts across Southern Oregon. And so someone from the public driving, across the landscape, they don't know when they cross one line of a district to another. And so we've tried to create some uniformity that will allow people to, have better understanding, to know what they can do and when they can do it. And so that really is all about fire prevention. And we, and it's going to vary. Clearly fire danger is a lot more severe down here for more days than it is up around Eugene. But there is more uniformity now, and hopefully it's clear to understand, and we've created messaging that will hopefully help with that. So if you can, those of you that raised your hand, if this summer, if you if it still is confusing, we want to fix that, because we know the vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing all the time, and we want to help do that. And the last thing we want to do is have someone have a fire because there was a misunderstanding about what was allowed and not allowed. So.
Thank you. Gene, anything?
I wanted to applaud Dave and ODF. I have certainly noticed a really large improvement over the last several years in terms of the availability of that kind of information, and especially on the ODF website and the website blog. It's readily available, easy to share. And I just want to add, in terms of prevention, I think public education is really a huge asset, as well as common sense. And that's a really important thing, especially in my district. Every single year before the start of fire season, we have 1, 2, 3 or more fires, human caused, that are a result from usually open burning or debris burning. It's not fire season, so it's still legal to burn, but a little bit of common sense would probably dictate this is not a good time to burn anymore. So we need to add that asset to our toolbox, as well as all the regulations that are in place.
So it seems like we've talked about risk assessment, a little bit about mitigation, about changing the fuels so that when we do get a fire, it's a different kind of a fire. We've made some recommendations about prevention. What else can we tell this audience about how they can avoid transferring risk? I mean, own the risk. I think there's plenty of resources for folks to know how to make your property a little less likely to burn. And what do you do when fire impinges on you, or if you're affected by smoke? Is there anything else that we could offer them? Anything shiny and new that we need to tie people into here? If it comes up for you, we'll return to it. So I'd like to talk about, we're about halfway through our time here this evening. Yes, you bet.
Well, as we saw in the campfire, one of the big things
That was the fire.
yeah, in Paradise, not a campfire, but the campfire, is the need to get people evacuated early when a fire starts. And so being informed about what the evacuation levels are, what they mean, and making sure you are signed up for the Jackson and Josephine County Alert System, which is called Everbridge or Citizen Alert. How many people are signed up in Citizen Alert? That's pretty good, maybe half, but there's probably half of you who aren't going to get the evacuation notification when it goes out. There are different ways that happens. Ashland actually has a little different system. It's still kind of part of that system, but it's called Nixle, and we put out lots of information about how to sign up for Nixle. But if you have a landline, which a lot of people don't have landlines these days, landlines are entered into those alert systems, commonly referred to as reverse 911 systems also. Landlines are captured. So if you have a landline, that data gets captured by the agencies that run that program, and you're in there. But if you aren't home and you want to find out about an evacuation that might be happening at your house, or you could even register another location like a school or an elderly parent's house, you can put those locations into the system too when you register. But if you don't have a landline and you just have a cell phone, those cell phone numbers cannot be captured in those systems. You have to put your number voluntarily into the system. And so that relies on you actually doing something, going to a computer, registering via the county website. Jackson or Josephine County have information on their websites about how to register. Ashland does as well. It can be a pretty simple process, but we've seen the difficulties in other communities with getting those notifications out and getting them out early. And that I think that's one of our pledges to you is we need to get that message out as fast as we possibly can when structures are threatened, so that you have the most time to get out of there safely. And it's not always an easy thing when the crews are first showing up on scene. They want to try to get a hold of the fire, but something that we're going to start training harder on these days is if it's obvious that homes are going to be impacted, we need to go into that rescue mode right away, and that includes sending out those alerts as fast as we can possibly do it. They all work by cell phones on our end, so I can launch an alert out in the middle of the woods as long as I've got cell phone reception, and it will go to as many people as I want it to go to. So do go home and figure that out and be part of that system. It's really important for your safety.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to take the opportunity too to kind of expound on that a little bit, because if you take a look at a lot of those large devastating fires, when the responders are getting there, what's the first thing that they're actually doing? Is they're trying to evacuate people on out of there, and they're not able to take any type of suppressive action whatsoever because their number one priority, again, is life and trying to get that life on out of there. And so how many people have heard of the three different levels, level 1, 2, and 3, or ready, set, go, right? I hate to say it, but in Southern Oregon, with the exception of just a couple of months, you might as well consider yourself to be in a level 1. So we should just start there, It's kind of putting a plan in place that says if something bad does occur, how am I going to get out of here? Where am I going to go? The next one is level 2, and to be honest with you, you start getting into the month of June, okay? You should be thinking level 2. You should be thinking about those things that you've got packed, all those really important documents or keepsakes or whatever it is that you think that you really want to save. you better be thinking about it then, before the incident occurs. Like Dave was mentioning, this will be my 39th year, and I've been involved in a lot of evacuations, and it's amazing what people will try to save, or it's amazing what people go back in to save because they're in panic mode, and they'll save the darndest things. So what I'm saying is really in the month of June for this area, start thinking about that level 2 and all of those things that you really want to have in that bag ready to go when you get out the door. And then when you do hear level 3, we take it very serious. The sheriff is the one that actually comes up with those levels. They're the ones that are actually responsible for getting people out. But we get a large group of folks together, some really smart people get together to make those decisions on level 1, 2, or 3. And we take it very serious when we say level 3. So a group of people say level 3, that really does mean go. And so you need to get out there as quick as you possibly can. So again, Southern Oregon, I'd probably say sometime right about March, you're in a level 1, okay? I'm not the sheriff, but I'm just gonna throw that one out at you. And probably sometime around June or so, you're in a level 2, so think about those things that you want to take with you, because that really is important. As if you take a look at those large devastating incidences, that's where a lot of those fatalities occurred, was in that evacuation process.
Chris, what, or anyone, what about evacuation route planning? Is that, are we where we need to be? Do people know how to get out of their communities and where they're going to go?
That one's a little controversial. Ashland went down the path years ago of dedicating wildfire evacuation routes, and we put up pretty little signs that say wildfire evacuation route in hopes that we could direct people to the quickest way down off the hill and down onto the main arterial streets in town. But you could also argue we shouldn't dedicate those areas because we don't know where the fire is going to start. We don't know where it's going to come from. It might come from over the hill, but it might come from within the community and be burning up the hill towards the forest. So you can make a case either way on evacuation routes. Maybe we should dedicate them, maybe we shouldn't. One of the issues in coming in to a community for the mutual aid, so when the state fire marshal sends those strike teams and task forces down, they got to be able to get into the area. And that's something that's a problem in all the mass evacuation type fires, is how do we get the additional resources for putting the fire out into the community while everybody is trying to get out of the community. And so we're going to engage in traffic studies and looking at how we need to manage traffic to get in and out of town in those kinds of scenarios. I think we're better off than what happened in Paradise because we have more exit points that aren't going to be, we hope, aren't going to be on fire as people are trying to use them. But there are plenty of communities across Jackson and Josephine County that have really challenging exit strategies. And it's worth talking to your local officials, the fire chief, city council, whoever you can get a hold of to talk about how do we get out of here when things get really bad. And there's no easy answer, and there may not be a right answer because it depends on what the fire is doing at the time. And that's another reason to be registered into those alert systems, is because you can get mobile alerts via texts, emails, phone calls, whatever you want. And if you're not at home and you're trying to evacuate, you're going one way, and then all of a sudden you get a message that says, oh, I better go the other way, then, well, you better listen to that message and go where the incident command folks are telling you to evacuate.
Yes, Gene, I can see you're reflecting on your recent experience there.
Well, I was just thinking in our case, in our little mountain district, it's a pretty simple formula. There are only 3 ways in or out. So we don't have to do a lot of planning, just find out where the fire is and go the other way. But that being said, I want to reiterate and emphasize the importance of having data, having intelligence on what's going on. And the best way to do that as a resident or a citizen is to sign up for this Citizens Alert and get that information in a very timely manner. And it could save your life. So it's very, very important. And it's something that I emphasize every chance I get in my district.
So I'd like to hear about infrastructure, your firefighting infrastructure. That's facilities and equipment that maximize your tactical options. And what do you see coming? What are advances in fire? Are we getting any better at fighting fire? Is there anything we need to do? I mean, you know, we keep building bigger airplanes, but there's a limit to that.
I think we're obviously looking at, what could technology do for us? The equipment that we're sending to the incidences is obviously better than the equipment that Dave and I originally started out with, again, 39 years ago. So we do have better equipment. We do have better personal protective equipment. We've got better training for the resources, both in safety and in tactics. But I think we're just on the tip of the spear when we're really looking at what kind of data is out there that we can use to be more successful. There's a couple different programs that we're looking at right now. One of them, MODIS, which is really kind of a neat thing, is we get a satellite image of the fire itself. And so we can actually look at where is the heat of the fire at, what direction is it going? Those areas that have actually gone out and plotted all of their homes and those things, we can actually see those as well. So we know if it's threatening a community, not threatening a community, where we need to send the most resources. So if we look, instead of before, we'd have to get a number of folks out on the ground and they'd have to triage it, assess it. Now we have the ability, because of satellites imaging, to say this is really collectively where we need to send that first set of apparatus on in. The other thing that we've just started using the last couple years are drones. And where the drones really help us is they can get underneath the smoke. So we always hear, everybody's got a lot of really great, and there's probably a number of you in the room that got really great suggestions on aviation resources and the types of resources that we should use. And I always say we got these really smart aviation folks on these incident management teams, and they'll use any tool that they can possibly use. Their biggest frustration over the last probably 3 or 4 years is the fact that we can't fly it, and we can't fly it because of the smoke. So what we found is there's a number of these drones that you can actually get that can go underneath the smoke, and they can actually give us an assessment on where is the fire at, where is it going. If anybody here remembers the Eagle Creek fire, which was a couple years ago that was over in the gorge, we were actually able to use one of those drones, and we were able to transmit it to the folks on the ground. So now you can take, your little smartphone, and you can get some of that imaging. And so I'm out there on the incident at nighttime. And as we know, at nighttime, it's really difficult to see exactly where is the fire at and where it's going. And it's fairly dangerous to be doing that. But we believe we can do really good work at night. So now we're able to, they can go on their phones and all of a sudden they go, well, there's the fire. It's still on the other side of the ridge, or it's coming over the ridge. So there's some tools out there that I think that we are in the process of assessing and seeing how it can not only help us tactically, but how it can help us with safety as well.
So Jim talked about drones getting under the smoke, and we've seen some great use of drones as well over the last couple of years. But there's another aircraft called a multi-mission aircraft, and we've utilized one of those from Colorado over the last 3 years. I don't think we were able to get it this last in 2018. But that actually flies, I don't know that it's above the smoke, it's in the smoke, but it's really high. But it flies fast. It's got incredibly sensitive I don't even know the technology. I'll say it's infrared because I don't know what it's called. But it's able to detect fires at, like a campfire from a long ways away, very high. And when you all are suffering from smoke in your valley, the state-of-the-art smoke detection system that we have is basically obsolete. It can't look through the smoke. So one of these aircraft, and we've been able to borrow one, and I hope we can again, but it's been able to pick up some fires for us that we didn't know were there, and that's been really huge. Last summer in Eastern Oregon, we were short. I mean, we couldn't get that aircraft. We couldn't get infrared imagery from any other sort of process. So we used some technology from the military, and they were able to fly, which was a huge benefit because they picked up a couple fires, and I think one of them was 100 acres in size that we didn't even know about because there was too much smoke. And so, so that sort of thing could be really beneficial to us as well. Despite the fact that the smoke detection cameras do get smoked out and can have periods of time during the summer that they're not useful, expanding that would be really huge as well, because they're not only useful for the detection, but our fire managers can, just like Jim can pick up, you know, lots of things on his phone, our fire managers can have their phone look and, I mean, I could right now pick up our smoke detection camera if it were not dark outside and show you, you know, what a particular fire was doing. If you're a fire manager and you can look at that and you can make an instantaneous decision whether you need to send more of any sort of resource to that fire because it's doing something that you weren't expecting. So that's really huge as well. So expanding that would be great. And not so much, and so one other thing to answer your question, sorry if I'm taking too much time here.
We got time.
And it's not really a technology thing as such, but it is something that's out there that we're dabbling in a bit in Western Oregon now. It's been in Eastern Oregon, but that's the Good Neighbor Authority. And the purpose of the Good Neighbor Authority is to help advance the pace and scale of restoration on federal lands. And so that'll, you know, through the Good Neighbor Authority, there's lots of things that we can do, and we've got a lot of work that's going on. We're pretty sensitive about the Good Neighbor Authority because, you know, there's different work there. There's some funding that the Forest Service and the BLM has that we can use and help some restoration projects on those lands. But then there's another whole element of the Good Neighbor Authority that involves timber sales. And so we're really sensitive about Good Neighbor Authority because any Good Neighbor Authority project that involves a timber sale, the bulk of those revenues come to the Department of Forestry for us to use on future restoration projects. Those are funds that the county wouldn't get. And so we're sensitive to that. We're having lots of conversations with the counties about that. And we're really careful that the work that we're doing, particularly in relation to timber sales, is additive. It's above and beyond what the normal work is that the counties or that the forests or the BLM would be doing, so that it's not taking revenues from immediate revenues from the county. So that's another item that is out there that will help, hopefully, in the long term, reduce some fuels across the landscape in strategic ways that will help us control fires.
Thank you. Good. Yes, Gene?
As far as technological improvements, I think we're going to get the most bang for our buck in improving detection technology. And just a really brief story. Last fire season, we had a 10-acre fire burning right adjacent to Highway 66. There was lots of traffic going by both ways for hours while this fire was burning. Nobody reported it because nobody could see it through all the smoke from all the other fires. So it was a big, serious fire right by the highway, and it was undetectable until we got lucky. And Klamath Falls, I believe, who at the time had access to MODIS or to satellite imagery, was able to pick up this hotspot on a satellite infrared image, and they transmitted that information to our Jackson County ODF, and we were notified of this fire in that way. So, yeah, anything we can do to improve detection, technologically speaking, is going to pay huge dividends. And I had a question, Dave. Do we have that available to us in Jackson County? MODIS? Oh, yeah. We do, okay. At the time of this fire, I was under the impression that it was not.
No, I was down here a lot this summer, and I was using MODIS. So maybe there was a day. Sometimes with any technology, there's anomalies on a given day, and maybe it wasn't up that day. But yeah, I'm certain that it is. I can check though.
Yeah, because that was a huge asset. Otherwise, if we had not caught that fire with that satellite imaging, it easily would have gone to 50, 100 acres, and then from that point could have turned into a catastrophic fire.
Where are your most notable resource shortages in any of you? What do you really, really need to have more of? You see in a typical fire season, when it gets gnarly toward the end, people start saying, we have critical shortages of, for instance, Type 1 crews, Type 1 aircraft. What are the things that you worry about that you really need to add to your toolkit? We'll start with you, Jim.
Yeah, I want to make a plug, as we've been talking about these mega fires and these epic fires, and we've been talking about detection, is we have a number of departments that are here. We have a number of departments that didn't really want to be noted or not, but that's really where it starts, is we really need to take a look at our local initial attack resources. Because as you know, these fires are getting up and they're going so fast. So by the time we arrive, or by the time the state gets there, these things are already, 1,000 acres, 2,000, 3,000 acres. So I just want to make a plug is really what can you do locally is one, if you see it, don't assume somebody else has seen it, call it in, that's okay. And the other piece is support your local responders, because I think that's what we need to do is make sure that we're equipped better at that initial attack mode to hit it hard and hit it fast.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
So 5 or 6 years ago, we asked ourselves that question in Southern Oregon, and what came back from our district foresters was aircraft and crews. And we've made some improvements in those arenas locally on local districts, but those still are needs locally. And when I say crews, there's lots of crews out there, but when I say crews, a locally controlled crew, probably 10-person-ish size crew, that we can stick on a fire immediately. We don't have to go through the ordering process, which can take a little bit of time, but we can get them on there immediately. So those were key then, and they're still important now. What as our fire seasons have kind of continued to get longer, and we've seen a shortage of middle managers on fires. It takes a long time to get folks trained up. So those of you that know the lingo, division supervisors, task force leaders, we brought in 20 of them from New Zealand and Australia last summer to help us in a pinch. And so we have the ability to go out and get folks like that, but it takes a while to get them here. And so those are key. Our agency put together an initiative kind of answering that question, what do we need to get through these next fire seasons? So that is out there. You could Google that and see what that is, and that's out there for the legislature to consider this year. So,
Chris, you want?
Well, inherently, the answer is always money, right? If we had more money, we could do lots of cool things. Well, indeed, that is true. And we talk about the landscape approach to creating opportunities to better manage wildfires, to be able to be more successful in suppressing them. We need more money to turn the corner and make the landscape one that is manageable. That's part of this Rogue Basin strategy proposal, and it is not cheap. There's an old way of thinking about how we do work in the woods that is kind of predicated on we're getting money out of the deal. We're going to go and we're going to do some logging, and it's going to pay for itself, and maybe we put some money in our pockets. And we need to start thinking about the forest in a different way. It's not necessarily a cash cow. Yes, some commodities, some logs can be a result of that, but they're the result of doing the work that needs to be done out there. And we can't expect that that work is always going to turn a profit or even pay for itself, because honestly, a lot of the bad fires start in places that aren't tall timber. They're tall grass and brush. And as we know, well, you're not going to make a lot of money cutting tall grass and brush, but nonetheless, that's a lot of the work that needs to happen, especially in our lower elevation areas around communities. So we need a significant investment, and our congressional delegation is doing, I think, a pretty good job of asking for that. I know the governors of Oregon, Washington, California recently asked the administration to double the wildfire budget, the wildfire suppression and prevention budget. I don't know where that's gone. We have now doubled the capacity of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, one that could definitely benefit Southern Oregon. That would be a $4 million a year shot in the arm for this kind of work. There's money on the way from the state that we're going to be doing a press release about very soon, but all of that is not enough. And if we want to see the benefits from this kind of work, we need to invest heavily and we need to invest soon and not let that straggle on for years and years and years as we try to figure out what we need to do. We already know what we need to do. There's a plan for it. We just need the money to start putting it together. And it's going to be a difficult road to get that much money, but the alternative is not a very good one. And so I think that we see what we need to do and we keep delivering that message to our politicians and they hear it and realize that that investment has to be made.
Thank you. Anything, Jane? Anything on your wish list or something that keeps you up at night?
Well, in terms of a wish list, it's actually kind of a silly question because we're such a tiny little department, so we need everything.
Yeah.
Money, number one, more volunteers, more equipment. So, yeah, what keeps me up at night is a repeat of what happened last spring with the Klamathon fire, and or any large fire in my district, because it is such a heavily forested, very, very dense forest area. Lots of residents, only 3 ways in or out. So, yeah,
Okay.
that's what keeps me up.
Thank you. And Jim?
I just wanted to kind of go back on that piece. You know, we talk about money, and when we're asking for money, you know, everybody starts to kind of cringe. So if I was to look at this room and say, hey, we need $100 million, right? If you really want us to help with this problem, we need $100 million. How many people in this room would think I was crazy? And it's okay if you raise your hand. Or I could say, you know what we need? $500 million to pay for what happened last year. And that's really when you take a look at the state of Oregon, it was $500 million on federal and private lands. And so we had to go, and our office alone, the State Fire Marshal's office, had to request $30 million. I can tell you $30 million will buy you a lot of equipment, and $30 million will buy you a lot of protection. So those are the things that we really have to start thinking about, is how much do we want to continue to spend on suppression. You know, we're going to have to really dig down deep, and we're really going to have to make that decision that we do want to solve this problem, and it is going to take some funding to do so. So, thank you.
Good point, yeah. Thanks. Is there anything I'm forgetting to ask you all that you're just dying to talk about before I introduce our mystery guest? Okay, so we'll come back to you. So, speaking of resource gaps and adequacy of resources in the state of Oregon, from the governor's office, we have Alex Campbell. Come on up, Alex. I sure hope you're still there. And Alex is the Regional Solutions Coordinator for the Southern Oregon region in the office of Governor Kate Brown. He previously served as Executive Director of the Partnership for Economic Development in Douglas County, and he led the resource and economic development efforts of the city of Milwaukee in Clackamas County. And take it away.
Thank you to Representative Marsh for including our office. And I want to also share my apology. The leader of our Governor's Natural Resource Office, Jason Miner, really wanted to be here tonight. He looked at flights, but couldn't make it work. But I am really pleased to be here. I live here, so I care a lot about the issues that we're talking about tonight. First, a lot of the things that I want to emphasize tonight have already been mentioned. We can access additional supplemental funds in the case of the sort of funding the acute response to fire. But the issues that we've been talking about, the prevention funding, and it's a scale of increase of funding that's really significant. And so, on the one hand, the answer or our position or what we know is pretty simple. We know we need more money. On the other hand, the legislature is not very responsible to statements. We know we need more money, but trust us, we'll spend it wisely. So the governor will shortly be announcing, already has been alluded to in her budget, in an executive order that'll come out shortly, the Governor's Commission on the Future of Wildfire Preparedness in Oregon. And that is to make a detailed case with our eye on the next short session to talk to the legislature, not only about funding, but also our model of fire response. One of the things that Dave didn't talk about is we have the model of a lot of ODF employees are called to different duties during fire season. With the longer fire season, is that really the right model to go about things? We have the questions of what is the appropriate balance between prevention and suppression that we were just talking about. We feel like we need some really clear answers on those questions to present to the legislature, particularly as we do believe that there are significantly more resources needed. One of the other items that we didn't touch on a lot today is the difference between protected and unprotected areas. There are a number which really was highlighted in Josephine County this past year, and that's an issue where several property owners were left with bills of I think 6 figures because there was a state response to a fire that threatened their property, but they were not in an area that was protected by a fire protection district. And so that's another issue that really needs to be addressed and looked at thoroughly and carefully. The commission will have a broad representation. It would have been announced probably already if we didn't have confirmation that we have the right chair. We believe that it's very important that this be announced with the chair identified and it's the right person. So that you'll hear about that shortly. The topics to be considered are not limited to, but clearly the top 2 are funding for wildfire response and the method of response. It will also we are expecting and that there would be subcommittees looking at forest health and resilience, problems of wildfire smoke, and also assistance to communities who are suffering the consequences of wildfires. I've spent a lot of my last couple of years working with folks in Brookings and in Illinois Valley in response to Chetco Bar Fire, in response to the Taylor Creek Fire. Governor has been on the ground here with us, with Dave, with Jim. She's very aware that there's significant impacts on a wide variety of communities, not only because of the threat of smoke, but the threat of destruction, but also the smoke. I was glad to hear Chief Chambers mention that the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative. Many of those folks are here. The additional funding that OWEB approved this week is valuable, and I think it was a step in bringing that to scale. And I think the folks who have been working on that for years are to be commended. That the level of planning and prioritization that went in, that provides the basis for that plan, I think makes funders very comfortable with providing the resources to carry that out. And so I think that's going to continue to serve the region well. I also mentioned just a small item, the Good Neighbor Authority was mentioned as well. Governor Brown did make that permanent. That is allowing state employees to be working on federal lands. Clearly, the relationship between the state and the state's approach and the feds approach on federal land is something that we will continue and needs to continue to be discussed. And that is not something that's outside of the purview of this commission. I think that those are the chief primary points I wanted to touch on, and I thank you all for coming out tonight and including our office.
Thank you. Do any of you have questions for clarification for Alex? Because we have time to explore this.
I probably exhausted my knowledge.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Alex also just mentioned the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Strategy and the collaborative. Chris has also referred to it a couple of times, and to a broader effort in the western states. Chris and I talked about earlier about the cohesive strategy. So, Chris, could you just put a couple of words on, at the strategic level, we've talked about tactics and mitigation, individual mitigation, and how to protect yourself and your home from fire, and how to get out when it's time and all. But what about on the, let's just say the Western States strategy, how does that tier to the basin-wide strategy? And then other than picking up a little brochure in the lobby, folks here can, whether you agree with that strategy or disagree with it, I believe you could do a lot by at least understanding it and trying to weigh in on it and put the collective power of your problem-solving abilities into this. So can you amplify what I'm trying to say here a little bit? I think you know more about the cohesive strategy than I do.
I'm still learning. Just recently joined the board of that organization, but I'm very familiar with what that work looks like on the ground. The Ashland project that we've been working on for over 9 years now is an example of what that cohesive strategy plan for the Rogue Basin will look like when it hits the ground. There's jobs, yes. There's reducing fuels. There's work near communities. There's work on the landscape. And the National Cohesive Strategy is something that most people never heard of. And honestly, although we all kind of work under that strategy and we know about it, it's not something you have to know about. It's more an internal kind of thing. But the way that the National Cohesive Strategy is put together is it's tying together multiple levels of agencies from the federal all the way down to the very, very local, volunteer districts even. It ties us together in how we respond to fire and how we work together, but also how we collaboratively and cooperatively manage landscapes for resiliency. So there's 3 pieces to that strategy. One is effective fire response. Another one are resilient landscapes, so landscapes that can experience fire and not necessarily in a detrimental way. And then also the communities piece, fire-adapted communities, how in our own neighborhoods, in our own streets, in our own cities and towns, how do we figure out how we're going to address the risk, own that risk of fire, and then address it in a constructive way within the framework of our community. So when we think about it, we think of those 3 different tenets of the cohesive strategy. The Rogue Basin strategy is a regional proposal to address that resilient landscape piece. The cohesive strategy, or the Rogue Basin strategy, also pairs with the 2-county fire plan, an effort that I've been working with since 2005. And the fire plan actually, Rogue Valley Integrated Fire Plan, actually tackles the fire adapted, the community piece of it, more than it tackles the landscape piece, though the Rogue Basin strategy is one of the elements of that 2-county fire plan. So those are all like really long documents that you read before you go to sleep at night, because it only takes a couple minutes before you want to put it down. But they're really useful documents to align strategies amongst different levels of government and even on the private industry side. This is one example of how that national strategy is expressed at the local level. Is there more to it than that?
I think that's really good, and thank you for doing that. That scratches an itch for me. We're not in this just by ourselves. We're not the only little valley that's under threat here.
We are not.
Before I call Pam up here to conclude, I want to ask you all a question, and I think, just so we don't leave this on a real grim note about, I think we agree that these it says here, unrelenting and persistent conditions. So you just alluded to fire adapted communities. We talked a lot tonight about changing the landscape to be more resilient in fire. We probably could talk quite a bit more about what a fire adapted community is, but one of those things is the community communication with between protection agencies, between the agencies capable of affecting the landscape. What can we tell them individually, tell these folks? How do you remain resilient? Let's just say we have another fire season like we had the last 2 years. What do we do differently? How do we stick together as a community? How do we protect ourselves? Anybody got any inspirational messages here? Please.
One of the things that I saw, and it was fairly late in the season, where folks in Ashland started talking about, we really need to get downtown and support our local businesses. You know, I think there's during their session, there was a lot of talk about staycations, right? And I think a lot of small businesses really struggle. A lot of medium-sized businesses have been impacted hard. I guess one things we might want to think about is, you know, September was surprisingly clear this past year, and so on the economic impact side, you know, the state has funded a study to help some of our tourist dependent businesses think about how they adapt and what kind of seasonality and what kind of approaches they might take. But I think as a community, there are things that we can do, you know, especially if we start thinking about it up front and about continue to support the businesses that are impacted.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think to tier what Alex said is Ashland has got together, obviously a tourist-dependent economy, significant impacts to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival are already happened and happening, and the trickle down to that in the Ashland economy is pretty serious. I've got very good friends that are right now thinking about selling their house and moving, and I'm sure you have either had similar thoughts or know people who are having similar thoughts. And so, you know, thinking about that at the community scale, we came up with a program called Smokewise Ashland. And what we tried to spread in Smokewise, and it's a partnership with the Ashland Chamber of Commerce, also with our local hospital through the Asante system, and then we've got local organizations like the YMCA and the university at the table as well. And, you know, part of it is saying, okay, there's going to be smoke. What can we do to make the best of it? What are the public health recommendations that we can best embrace and follow through on? What kind of filtration is needed in our school system? Actually, because of testimony that I gave at a school bond committee meeting, the Ashland School District passed a bond to revamp all of the air conditioning systems to be smoke compliant. I don't know what exactly the word is, but in their new bond, they're going to go and totally overhaul all the air handling systems so that students can be safe when they're in school and there's smoke in the air. So those kinds of things are happening. We're going to host a regional leaders conference about Smokewise and thinking about smoke at the end of February to get more people on board with this. And it goes from, you know, everything from the smallest business to large organizations. And, you know, as an example, the university during the smoke this year, they replaced all their filters with the high-grade HEPA filters, and then they invited the community to come in and spend time indoors in their new recreation facility in the library so that there were public spaces that people knew were clean and they could go hang out in. And, you know, part of the challenge is social isolation when we get into those smoky times, and we all just want to sit in our house and we don't want to go outside because then we'd have to go into the smoke, and it's uncertain as to where you're going would be a place that's healthy to hang out. And so having public spaces where people can connect is really important. And I think that's something that we're moving quickly towards, having already done some of it, but we can embrace a lot more of that community type spirit as we move forward. And I think that we all could benefit from doing more of that in those smoky summers that we will have in the future. Hopefully not every year, but there's bound to be some more smoke.
Thank you. Anyone else, anything you wish I'd asked you or you want to comment on? Pam, could you come up and wrap it up for us and maybe recap a little bit about what you've heard here today and where all this information goes next?
It has been my theory that one of the way that we can cope with these persistent and difficult conditions that we've been facing, what I've characterized as really an existential crisis as we look around our community and try and figure out what the future offers us, is to empower ourselves with the understanding of the situation that's facing us. That was the reason that we brought the community together in the Smoke and Fire Summit in September, is to really pool our joint wisdom about how we can stay economically resilient, how we can address the health impacts facing our communities, how we can gather resources together to do the critical forest management work that is so important to prevention. And we heard a lot about that tonight. And tonight's Wildfire Forum was the second in that effort. And I think, I hope that you will join me in feeling that we are very fortunate in that we have agencies and personnel who are assigned to be diligent, to watch over our community, starting with the very, very tiny rural fire districts, which are the first spokes out on the ground, and including the Oregon Department of Forestry, which has as its focus safety, but is always moving immediately on the fires that approach our communities. The State Fire Marshal's office, which has the ability, as described, to really garner support from fire departments across the state and to deploy them when needed to hotspots across the state. And of course, we have the U.S. Forest Service, not represented here tonight, but an agency that we know brings a lot of support to our communities. So there are a lot of people out there looking out for us, and I think that should be of comfort to all of us as we look toward the next fire season. And I also heard a lot of marching orders going forward after tonight. We heard a lot of actions that we need to take to make sure that we remain as safe a community as possible. And I've got my notes right here, and I'm sure the other legislators in the room do too. We heard about detection and the importance of technology that will allow us to detect these fires more quickly than ever and to get at them more quickly than ever. We heard about the importance of funding local initiatives so that we can both do work in the forest and so that those local firefighters can get out there on the ground as quickly as possible. We heard about the value of aircraft, the need to really identify and fund crews. We heard about the importance of middle managers. And overall, we heard about the importance of cash, because all of these operations, both on the prevention side and the suppression side, need our ability to invest in them. So we have a lot of marching orders going forward. We have a governor's task force, which is going to take on the critical issues around workforce and funding as we see fire seasons that are very different in the future than the ones we've seen in the past. So a lot of great information shared tonight. I hope it was valuable to you. And I want to acknowledge the wonderful panelists who spent their evening with us and thank them for coming down. They may have a few minutes if you want to grab them for a specific question. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight and sharing this really critical community discussion.
Thank you.